In early 1942, the Allies were losing ships faster than they could replace them. If the trend had continued just a few months longer, the war effort would have collapsed without a single decisive battle. What unfolded in the Atlantic after Pearl Harbor was not a gradual setback, but a sudden systemic failure. German U-boats, freed from constraints that had limited them earlier in the war, launched a sustained assault on Allied shipping that exposed a catastrophic weakness. The United States had entered the war with confidence in its industrial power, yet its coastal defenses were unprepared for submarine warfare on a massive scale. Merchant ships sailed with lights on, convoys were rare, anti-submarine coordination was minimal. German commanders quickly realized the opportunity and exploited it ruthlessly. In the first months of 1942 alone, hundreds of Allied ships were sunk within sight of American shores. Oil tankers burned off the coast at night, visible from beaches and city skylines. Supplies meant for Britain, the Soviet Union, and Allied armies simply vanished into the ocean. This was not just a naval problem. It was an economic and strategic crisis unfolding in real time. Every ship lost carried fuel, food, vehicles, ammunition, or raw materials that could not easily be replaced. The Allied war effort depended on constant movement across oceans. Factories without materials went idle. Armies without fuel stood still. The Atlantic was the artery of the Allied coalition, and it was hemorrhaging. What made the situation especially dangerous was the absence of immediate solutions. Shipyards could not replace losses fast enough. Escort vessels were limited. Radar, sonar, and air patrol coverage lagged behind the scale of the threat. The German submarine campaign was not just effective, it was outpacing Allied adaptation. British leaders understood the danger immediately. They had already endured years of U-boat warfare and knew how close starvation and industrial collapse could come. The United States, however, was learning these lessons under fire. Early warnings were ignored or underestimated. Command structures were fragmented. Navy, Army, and civilian shipping authorities operated with overlapping responsibilities and unclear priorities. Coordination lagged while losses mounted. German submarines did not need to sink warships to cause damage. They only needed to disrupt flow. Every merchant vessel destroyed multiplied consequences far beyond its tonnage. By mid-1942, the numbers were alarming. Allied shipping losses reached levels that threatened long-term sustainability. Lend-Lease deliveries to Britain and the Soviet Union were delayed or rerouted. Fuel shortages loomed. Food security became a concern. Even American domestic distribution felt strain as tankers disappeared faster than replacements arrived. The crisis was not widely discussed publicly. Censorship limited reporting. Morale concerns discouraged transparency. Yet behind closed doors, planners confronted a brutal reality. If the Atlantic could not be secured, nothing else mattered. Not Normandy, not North Africa, not the Pacific. The war would be lost through exhaustion rather than defeat. The danger of this crisis lies in how invisible it was to most people at the time. There was no single battle to point to, no dramatic turning point. Losses accumulated quietly, relentlessly, night after night. The ocean absorbed evidence. Survivors were rare. The system failed incrementally, making it harder to recognize how close it was to breaking. This is why the crisis remains poorly remembered. It lacked spectacle, but its consequences would have been absolute. What ultimately saved the Allies was not luck, but forced transformation under pressure. New convoy systems were implemented. Air patrol coverage expanded. Escort carriers entered service. Intelligence coordination improved. Technology caught up with threat. But these changes came only after months of devastation that pushed the system to its limits. The margin between recovery and collapse was narrow. Had adaptation come later, the outcome would have been irreversible. This crisis did not decide the war on its own, but it nearly ended it. It unfolded far from headlines, far from beaches and battlefields, and far from the heroic narratives that dominate memory. Yet it represents one of the most dangerous moments of World War II, when the Allies were not losing because of enemy superiority, but because the foundations of their war effort were quietly eroding beneath them. For Britain, the shipping crisis was not an abstract threat, it was existential. The island nation imported the majority of its food, fuel, and raw materials, and every sunk merchant ship tightened the noose. By 1942, British planners calculated that if losses continued at the current rate, starvation and industrial shutdown would follow within months. Grain shipments fell below safe levels. Fuel reserves dipped dangerously low. Factories producing aircraft, tanks, and ammunition faced shortages not because of bombing, but because materials never arrived. The memory of the First World War loomed heavily when U-boat campaigns had nearly forced Britain to its knees. This time, the scale was even greater. German submarines were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them, and American industry had not yet fully mobilized to compensate. The crisis reverberated beyond Britain. In the Soviet Union, the situation caused alarm at the highest levels. Lend-lease shipments from the United States were essential to keeping Soviet industry and armies functioning. Trucks, fuel, food, and machinery crossed the Atlantic and Arctic routes in massive quantities. When those convoys failed to arrive, entire operations were threatened. Stalin repeatedly pressed Allied leaders, demanding reassurance that supplies would continue. Every delay raised doubts about Allied reliability and long-term coordination. The war on the Eastern Front consumed resources at an unprecedented rate. Without steady inflow, the Red Army risked losing momentum at critical moments. The Atlantic crisis was now influencing battles thousands of miles away. What made this situation so dangerous was that it exposed a flaw in Allied planning. Strategy assumed uninterrupted logistics. In reality, logistics were under attack and losing. Military victories meant little if supplies could not reach the front. Armies could not advance without fuel. Aircraft could not fly without spare parts. Food shortages weakened morale and effectiveness. The crisis revealed that the Allies were fighting a modern war with systems still unprepared for total disruption. German submarines exploited this gap with precision. They did not need to win control of the seas. They only needed to deny safe passage long enough for the system to collapse. Inside Allied command circles, the tone shifted from concern to urgency. Meetings once focused on offensive planning turned into discussions about survival. Resources were reallocated. Naval priorities were rewritten. The protection of shipping began to outweigh offensive operations. Yet progress was slow. Escort vessels were scarce. Air patrols lacked range. Command coordination between nations remained fragmented. Every improvement lagged behind losses already incurred. The crisis created a race between adaptation and exhaustion, and for much of 1942, exhaustion appeared closer. The psychological impact was profound. Leaders understood that public acknowledgement of the crisis could damage morale and weaken unity. Information was tightly controlled. Sinkings were underreported. The scale of losses was kept vague. Civilians saw burning tankers offshore, but not the spreadsheets showing dwindling reserves. This secrecy contributed to the crisis being forgotten later. It unfolded behind closed doors, measured in tonnage and timelines rather than dramatic battles. By late 1942, the Allies stood at a crossroads. Either the Atlantic lifeline would be secured, or the war effort would grind down under its own weight. There was no middle ground. The stakes extended beyond military outcomes to the survival of entire nations and alliances. The war could not be won by bravery alone. It depended on an unbroken chain of supply stretching across oceans under constant threat. This moment forced the Allies to confront a reality they had underestimated. The enemy did not need to defeat them in battle. It only needed to outlast their ability to adapt. The Atlantic crisis stripped away illusions about industrial invulnerability and revealed how fragile modern warfare truly was. What followed would determine whether the Allies could recover in time, or whether this quiet, grinding emergency would succeed where direct confrontation had failed. The turning point did not arrive with a single invention or battle, but with a brutal realization. The Allies would lose the war unless they completely restructured how they protected shipping. Incremental fixes were no longer enough. In late 1942, Allied command finally treated the Atlantic crisis as the primary battlefield it had always been. Convoy systems were expanded and standardized, not just in the North Atlantic, but along American coasts where losses had been highest. Merchant ships were no longer allowed to sail independently. Escorts were reassigned from secondary duties. Air patrols were extended farther offshore, closing gaps submarines had exploited for months. New escort carriers entered service, providing continuous air coverage where land-based aircraft could not reach. These changes came at a cost. Offensive operations were delayed, resources were diverted, strategic priorities were rewritten under pressure. Technology played a decisive role, but only after organization caught up. Improved radar and sonar increased detection, but coordination made them lethal. Intelligence sharing between Britain and the United States accelerated, breaking down barriers that had slowed response times earlier in the war. Signals intelligence helped anticipate submarine movements, allowing convoys to avoid danger zones rather than blunder into them. New weapons increased the effectiveness of escorts, but discipline and doctrine mattered just as much. Crews were trained to hunt relentlessly, not just defend passively. Submarines were forced to stay submerged longer, reducing their speed, visibility, and effectiveness. Losses did not stop overnight, but the balance began to shift. By early 1943, the impact was unmistakable. Sinkings declined while submarine losses rose. German commanders reported growing difficulty locating targets and escaping counterattacks. What had once been an environment of near impunity became increasingly hostile. The Atlantic, which had favored the hunter, began favoring the defender. For the first time since the crisis began, Allied planners could calculate supply flows without assuming catastrophic losses. The hemorrhaging slowed. The artery began to heal. This recovery reshaped the entire war. Secure shipping enabled the buildup of forces for major offensives. Fuel and food stocks stabilized. Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union increased, strengthening Eastern Front operations. Britain regained a margin of safety that allowed long-term planning instead of constant crisis management. The Atlantic was no longer a question mark hanging over every strategic decision. It became a foundation rather than a liability. What makes this moment easy to overlook is its lack of spectacle. There was no single decisive engagement, no iconic victory image. Instead, success appeared as a change in graphs and reports. Tonnage delivered rose. Losses fell. Confidence returned gradually. The war did not suddenly become easy, but it became sustainable. That distinction mattered more than any single battle. The German submarine campaign did not fail because it lacked effectiveness. It failed because it could not adapt as quickly as the system it attacked. Once the Allies aligned technology, intelligence, and organization, the advantage shifted decisively. Submarines that once dictated tempo were now hunted. The same ocean that had concealed them became a trap. Yet even in victory, the crisis left a mark. Allied leaders understood how close collapse had come. The war's outcome depended not only on courage and firepower, but on the ability to recognize failure and change course fast enough. The Atlantic crisis exposed a truth that would shape post-war military planning. Wars are not lost only on battlefields. They are lost when systems fail silently. This realization transformed how modern warfare was understood. Logistics became strategy. Supply chains became targets and safeguards. The Allies did not simply survive the crisis. They emerged with a new understanding of what victory required in an industrialized world. By mid-1943, the immediate danger had passed, but its lessons remained. The war could now move forward, not because the enemy had vanished, but because the foundation beneath the Allied effort had finally stabilized. The crisis nobody talks about had been diffused just in time. When the Atlantic crisis finally receded, it did not disappear so much as sink beneath the surface of history. The Allies moved forward into more visible phases of the war: Normandy, Italy, the liberation of Western Europe. These events produced clear images of victory, identifiable heroes, and decisive dates. The shipping emergency that nearly strangled the war effort did not. Its success was defined by absence rather than spectacle. Ships arrived instead of burning. Factories ran instead of stalling. Armies advanced instead of waiting. Because disaster was avoided rather than endured, the crisis faded from public memory. Yet for those who managed the war, its impact was permanent. Allied strategy was rewritten around the assumption that logistics could no longer be treated as background infrastructure. They were now central, fragile, and decisive. The Atlantic crisis reshaped the balance of the war in ways that are easy to miss. Without secure shipping, the buildup for major offensives would have been impossible. There would have been no sustained bombing campaign, no mass mechanization of armies, no ability to project power across continents. The defeat of the U-boat threat did not win the war outright, but it made every later victory possible. It also exposed a critical asymmetry. The Axis powers could disrupt supply, but they could not replace the losses inflicted on their submarine fleet at the same pace. Once Allied production and coordination reached maturity, the German campaign became unsustainable. The window of opportunity closed and it never reopened. This realization influenced everything that followed. Post-war military planning treated supply chains as strategic targets and vulnerabilities. NATO doctrine emphasized convoy protection, integrated command structures, and joint intelligence from the outset. The memory of how close collapse had come shaped Cold War thinking, even if it was rarely discussed publicly. The lesson was clear. Industrial strength alone did not guarantee security. Adaptation speed mattered just as much. The Allies had nearly learned that lesson too late. The crisis also complicates simplified narratives of inevitability. World War II is often remembered as a story of overwhelming Allied capacity gradually grinding down the Axis. The Atlantic emergency reveals a far narrower margin. Victory depended on decisions made under pressure, amid uncertainty, with incomplete information. Had convoy reforms been delayed, had industrial coordination faltered, had political hesitation slowed adaptation, the war could have taken a drastically different course. The outcome was not preordained. It was earned through correction rather than dominance. What makes this episode uncomfortable is how ordinary its failure would have looked. There would have been no dramatic collapse, no single catastrophic defeat. The war effort would have slowed, then stalled, then fractured as allies competed for dwindling resources. Exhaustion would have replaced defeat as the deciding factor. The Atlantic crisis shows how modern wars can be lost quietly, through accumulation rather than catastrophe. That is why this crisis remains relevant. It demonstrates that the most dangerous threats are often systemic rather than spectacular. They do not announce themselves with headlines. They emerge in spreadsheets, shipping schedules, and production curves. They require attention before they become visible. The Allies survived because they recognized the danger in time and accepted the cost of radical change. They subordinated tradition, pride, and competition to survival. In the end, the crisis nobody talks about shaped the war as profoundly as any famous battle. It forced the Allies to become what they needed to be in order to win: coordinated, adaptive, and ruthless about priorities. The Atlantic did not grant victory, it demanded it. And for a brief, perilous moment, it nearly took everything away. This is not a forgotten footnote. It is a warning. Wars are not only decided by who fights better, but by who adapts faster when the system begins to fail. In World War II, the Allies came closer to losing that race than history often admits.